There is a concept in special operations that we called exploitation. It sounds clinical when you say it in a briefing room. It sounds almost bureaucratic, a word that belongs on a slide, not on a battlefield. But exploitation is one of the most powerful forces in warfare. And when it is executed correctly, it transforms a single successful strike into a cascading series of advantages that the enemy cannot stop, cannot predict, and cannot recover from fast enough to matter. What happened after that air defense battery was destroyed was exploitation in its purest and most devastating form. The gap that the strike created was not left open. It was walked through immediately, deliberately, with the full weight of every available asset that could be brought to bear on what lay beyond it. Understand what a gap in air defense coverage means in practical terms. It is not simply an absence of radar. It is an absence of consequence. In the areas where that battery had been providing coverage, movement had been disciplined by the knowledge that anything flying would be tracked, targeted, and engaged. That discipline, that invisible hand forcing caution, was now gone. Drone operators who had been forced to work around the edges of that coverage zone could now move through the center of it. They can fly higher, see farther, and hold station longer over targets that had previously been shielded by the simple fact that approaching them carried unacceptable risk. The destruction of one system had not just eliminated a threat, it had opened a window through which the entire depth of the Russian rear in that sector was now visible and reachable. And what the operators found when they looked through that window was exactly what you find when you pull back the protection from any system that believed itself to be safe: activity, movement. Patterns that had been hidden not by skill or by discipline, but by the assumption that no one was looking. Vehicles moving along routes that had been considered interior lines. Personnel gathering at points that had been designated as coordination nodes. Fuel being transferred at sites that had been positioned with the confident assumption that distance and air defense coverage together made them untouchable. That assumption had just been proven wrong, and the operators were already building the next target list before the crews at the burning battery had finished making the decision to evacuate. This is where I want to draw a direct line between what happened on that battlefield and something that every leader, military or civilian, needs to understand at a fundamental level. Systems do not fail at their strongest point. They fail at the seam between what they prepared for and what they did not. The Russian air defense network was designed and positioned to handle certain categories of threat at certain ranges and altitudes. It was not designed, or rather, it was not adequately adapted to handle the combination of persistent, low-altitude reconnaissance, patient target development, and precise, low-cost strike platforms operating in a coordinated sequence. The gap was not in the hardware. The gap was in the doctrine. And when doctrine fails to keep pace with the evolution of the threat, no amount of expensive equipment can compensate for that failure. I saw this pattern repeat itself throughout my career in different theaters, against different adversaries, with different technologies. The enemy that loses is almost never the enemy that was outgunned. It is the enemy that was outthought. The enemy that was still fighting the last war, while the adversary was already executing the next one. And what Ukraine has demonstrated in this phase of the conflict is a level of doctrinal adaptation that should be studied carefully by every military institution in the world. Not because the technology is new, drones have existed for decades, but because the integration of reconnaissance, target development, strike, and exploitation into a single flowing sequence represents a maturity of operational thinking that is genuinely significant. Let me walk you through what exploitation looked like in the hours that followed the destruction of that battery, because it was not a single second strike that came next. It was a sequence of pressure applied simultaneously across multiple layers of the Russian operational depth, each action feeding the next, each success creating the conditions for what followed. First came the fuel infrastructure. Fuel is the blood of a mechanized force, and without it, everything stops. Tanks do not advance. Helicopters do not fly. Generators that power communications and coordination go dark. The sites that store and distribute fuel had been positioned with what the planners believed was adequate separation from the front. That separation was now irrelevant. A drone carrying enough payload to ignite a storage tank does not require proximity in the way that artillery does. It requires targeting data and a path. The targeting data had been developed during the reconnaissance phase. The path had just been opened by the destruction of the air defense battery. The strike on the fuel storage was not a single hit and withdraw. This is the part that most analysis misses when it focuses on the footage rather than the sequence. After the initial impact, when the first tank caught fire and the pressure wave moved through the facility, the reconnaissance drone above did not leave. It watched. It cataloged who arrived and when. It tracked the emergency vehicles that came to suppress the fire. It noted which routes those vehicles used and where they came from, and in doing so, it identified secondary points of interest, maintenance depots, coordination points, vehicle staging areas that had revealed themselves through the act of responding to the disaster. The response to the strike became the intelligence for the next strike. That is exploitation. That is the ruthless logic of a system that does not treat individual events as endpoints, but as data points in an ongoing process. Now, here is where the human cost of this kind of warfare becomes impossible to ignore. And I say this not to sensationalize it, but because any honest analysis of combat must account for what it means to the men and women inside it. Russian soldiers operating in the rear areas of this sector had been functioning with a degree of confidence that the situation allowed for routine. Routine in a war zone is both inevitable and dangerous. It is inevitable because human beings cannot maintain maximum alertness indefinitely. The brain seeks pattern and predictability because sustained uncertainty is psychologically unsustainable. So soldiers eat at the same times. They move between the same points. They take breaks in the same locations because those locations have been safe before. And the mind defaults to the assumption that what was safe yesterday will be safe today. But in an environment where patient observation has mapped those routines from altitude, the routine itself becomes the targeting solution. A soldier stepping out of a structure at the same hour he has stepped out for the past 3 days is not just a man taking a break. He is a confirmation of a pattern that has been watched and recorded. And when an FPV drone closes at speed from an angle he has not anticipated, there is almost nothing that training or instinct can do in the seconds available. This is not a criticism of the soldiers. It is an indictment of a system that has not adapted its doctrine fast enough to protect them. Leadership at the operational level failed to account for the degree to which aerial observation had penetrated the rear, and the men at the lowest level paid the price for that failure. That is the brutal arithmetic of war, and it has not changed since the first armies marched across the first battlefields of human history. What has changed is the speed at which that arithmetic now operates. In previous eras, the process of reconnaissance, target development, and strike played out over hours, days, sometimes weeks. A scout would observe, report, and the information would travel up the chain of command, be assessed, be planned against, and eventually result in action. That timeline gave the enemy time to adapt, time to move, time to disperse and reduce his exposure before the strike could be executed. That timeline no longer exists in the same way. The same platform that observes can within minutes hand targeting data to a strike asset that is already airborne and already committed. The gap between being seen and being struck has compressed to the point where adaptation during that window is nearly impossible. You are either prepared before the observation begins, or you are not prepared at all. This is the operational reality that Russian forces are now navigating, and the evidence suggests they have not yet found a sustainable answer to it. Dispersal helps, but creates its own coordination problems. Camouflage and concealment reduce signature, but do not eliminate it. Moving at night reduces visual detection, but thermal signatures remain readable. Varying routes helps until the terrain constrains the options down to the same choke points, regardless of which approach is taken. Every countermeasure has a counter. And the side that is adapting faster, learning faster, and integrating its lessons into the next operation faster is the side that currently holds the operational initiative. On this particular day, in this particular sector, that side was Ukraine. Let me bring this to the level of strategic consequence, because I think that is where the full weight of what happened needs to be felt. A $25 million air defense system is not just a piece of equipment. It is a capability. It represents the ability to deny airspace to an adversary, to create a zone where your forces can operate without the constant overhead threat that degrades decision-making, slows movement, and forces the kind of dispersal that breaks coordination. When that capability is destroyed, the loss is not measured only in dollars or in metal. It is measured in the operational freedom that disappears with it. Every unit that had been operating under that umbrella must now recalibrate its behavior. Every plan that assumed that coverage must now be revised. Every commander in that sector must now answer a question that no commander wants to be asking in the middle of an active operation. How do I protect my people and my assets when the system I was counting on to protect them is gone? The answer to that question requires resources, replacement systems, repositioned assets, adjusted doctrine, retraining. All of that takes time, and time in this conflict is not neutral. Time spent reorganizing air defense coverage is time not spent on offensive action. Time spent rerouting supply convoys away from areas now exposed by the coverage gap is time not spent delivering what the front line needs. The destruction of one system creates a friction that spreads through the entire network it was part of. That friction is not visible in the strike footage. It does not show up in the explosion or the fire, but it is real, and it accumulates. Here is what I want you to carry with you as the final and most important idea of everything we have covered today. Warfare at its most advanced level is not about the destruction of individual targets. It is about the destruction of the enemy's ability to function as a coherent system. A coherent system has rhythm. It has tempo. It has the confidence to execute plans because the plans are built on predictable inputs. Fuel will arrive. Air cover will hold. Personnel will be where they are supposed to be. Communications will function. Command decisions will translate into action. Destroy that predictability, and you do not need to win every individual engagement. You create the conditions where the enemy begins to defeat himself through hesitation, through failed coordination, through the accumulation of small disruptions that combine into an inability to operate with the speed and confidence that modern combat demands. What Ukraine executed on this day was not simply a drone strike. It was a demonstration of system-level thinking applied to warfare through the medium of relatively low-cost, highly adaptable unmanned platforms. The reconnaissance drone, the FPV strike drone, the exploitation sequence, the follow-on targeting of fuel infrastructure, the pressure applied to Iskander-related positions and Rubicon-linked facilities. These were not separate events. They were chapters of a single document, a document written with patience and executed with precision. And the message of that document is one that military planners on both sides of this conflict and beyond it are reading very carefully right now. I have spent a lifetime around warriors, men and women who ran toward danger when every instinct said to run away, who held their positions when everything around them was collapsing, who made decisions under pressure that most people will never have to face. I have the deepest respect for what it means to serve, regardless of which uniform you wear. But respect for courage does not change the operational verdict. On this day, in this sector, one side demonstrated a level of integration between observation, patience, timing, and strike that the other side was not prepared to counter. That gap, the gap in doctrine, in adaptation, in the speed of learning, is the most important gap on this battlefield. Not the gap in the front line, not the gap in the air defense coverage, though that gap is real and consequential. The most important gap is the one between what a military force believes about the threat environment and what the threat environment actually is. Closing that gap requires something that is harder than procurement and harder than training: It requires institutional honesty, the willingness to look at what is happening on the battlefield without the filter of what you expected or hoped to see. To say clearly and without defensiveness, the situation has changed. The threat has evolved. Our doctrine has not kept pace. And then to act on that assessment with the speed that the situation demands. That is the hardest thing in any large organization, military or otherwise. The gravity of existing systems, existing beliefs, existing investments pulls constantly against adaptation. Overcoming that gravity requires leadership, real leadership, the kind that does not protect the comfort of the organization at the expense of the people inside it. The question this battle leaves behind is not whether drone warfare has evolved. It clearly has. The question is whether the institutions responsible for responding to that evolution are moving fast enough to protect their people and preserve their operational effectiveness. History is not patient with the answer to that question. It does not wait for committees to deliberate or for procurement cycles to complete. It renders its verdict in real time, on real ground, in the lives of real people. And the verdict on this day was clear. So I will close with the same question I always come back to when I analyze a significant operation. Not who won this engagement, but who is learning faster. Because in modern warfare, the learning rate is the decisive variable. The side that processes what happened today and integrates those lessons into tomorrow's operations faster than the adversary will hold the initiative. And holding the initiative, keeping the enemy in a reactive posture, forcing him to respond to your moves rather than making moves of his own, is the closest thing to a guarantee of eventual success that this kind of conflict offers. Ukraine learned from yesterday, it executed today, and it is already learning from what today revealed. If you think this was simply one successful operation, you are missing the deeper signal. The signal is that a doctrine has matured. A system has proven itself capable of operating across multiple layers of the battlefield simultaneously. And the side that is now forced to answer that system is running out of the one resource that strategy cannot replace: time. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening on this battlefield, beneath the footage, behind the numbers, inside the system, then share it. Because understanding this war at the level it deserves to be understood is the first step toward understanding what comes next. And what comes next, if this trajectory continues, will be unlike anything this conflict has seen before.